The morning sun peeked through the tall windows of James Mitchell's corner office on the 32nd floor of the Skyward Airlines headquarters. The 45-year-old CEO sat at his large desk, his fingers drumming against a stack of customer feedback reports. His usually neat brown hair was slightly messy from running his hands through it too many times, a habit he had when something bothered him. For 15 long years, James had run Skyward Airlines from this very office. The view was perfect. You could see planes taking off and landing at the airport in the distance. These planes carried his company's logo, a beautiful blue and silver design that he had helped create. But lately, something didn't feel right. Sarah Chen, his assistant for the past decade, had just brought him the latest customer satisfaction reports. The numbers weren't bad, but they weren't great either. Some passengers loved their experience, while others complained about different problems. As he read through the comments, James realized he had no idea what it was really like to fly on his own airline. When was the last time I actually flew on one of our planes? He asked himself quietly. The answer made him uncomfortable. It had been years. He always used the company's private jet for his business trips. The truth was, he had no idea what regular passengers experienced every day. James stood up and walked to the window. He watched as one of his planes took off, its silver body gleaming in the morning light. Then an idea hit him. What if he flew on his own airline like a regular passenger? Not as James Mitchell, the CEO, but as someone else? He pressed the intercom button. "Sarah, could you come in for a moment?" Sarah entered the office quickly, her tablet ready for notes. She had worked with James long enough to know when he had something important on his mind. "I need your help with something different," James said, turning away from the window. "I want to fly on one of our regular flights, but nobody can know who I am." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise, but she quickly understood. "Like an undercover boss?" she asked, a small smile appearing on her face. "Exactly," James nodded. "I need to see how things really work when nobody knows the boss is watching. Can you help me arrange it?" Over the next hour, they worked out the details. Sarah booked a ticket for a 6-hour cross-country flight under the name James Peterson. It was similar enough to his real name that he wouldn't forget to respond to it, but different enough to not draw attention. They thought about his disguise carefully. James usually wore expensive suits to work. That wouldn't do for this trip. They decided he would wear simple clothes, jeans, a plain blue sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. Sarah suggested he wear his old reading glasses instead of his contact lenses, and to mess up his hair a bit instead of keeping it perfectly styled. "The flight is in 3 days, Sarah said, checking her tablet. "It's a regular economy ticket on Flight 2477 from New York to Los Angeles. Middle seat, just like many of our passengers get." James hadn't sat in a middle seat in years. The thought made him a little nervous, but that was exactly why he needed to do this. How could he run an airline if he didn't know what his passengers went through? Before leaving the office that evening, James looked at himself in his private bathroom mirror. He practiced slouching a little instead of standing straight like he usually did. He needed to blend in, to be just another face in the crowd. 3 days, he said to his reflection. 3 days to see what Skyward Airlines is really like for our passengers. As he drove home that evening, James felt excited and nervous at the same time. He had built this airline into one of the biggest in the country, but now he would see it from a completely different angle. Little did he know, this decision would lead to changes bigger than he could imagine, all starting with a simple choice to step out of his comfort zone and into the real world of air travel. 3 days later, James arrived at New York's JFK airport wearing his carefully planned disguise. His comfortable jeans felt strange compared to his usual tailored suits, and the old glasses kept sliding down his nose. He had gotten to the airport 2 hours early, just like regular passengers had to do. Standing in the security line, James noticed how different everything felt from this side. Usually, he walked through the VIP security lane where staff would greet him by name. Today, he waited in line for 25 minutes, taking off his shoes and belt just like everyone else. After security, James found his way to Gate B-17, where Flight 2477 would depart for Los Angeles. He chose a seat near the corner of the waiting area, perfect for watching how his airline's ground staff worked. That's when he first saw the Thompsons. Martha and Robert Thompson stood at the check-in counter, both dressed neatly for travel. Martha wore a purple cardigan over a floral dress, while Robert had on pressed khaki pants and a light blue button-down shirt. They looked to be in their early 70s, and James could tell from their posture that they were used to carrying themselves with dignity. "Excuse me," Martha said politely to the gate agent, her voice gentle but clear. "We have priority boarding passes, and I wanted to make sure we're in the right line." The gate agent barely looked up from her computer. "Regular boarding hasn't started yet," she said quickly, already turning to help someone else. "Yes, but we have priority," Robert tried to explain, holding out their tickets. "Please wait until your group is called," the agent interrupted, now fully focused on helping another passenger who had just walked up to the counter. James watched as the Thompsons exchanged a quiet look. They moved away from the counter and found seats near him. You could see their priority boarding passes clearly. They should have been helped right away. "It's happening again, Robert," Martha said softly to her husband, straightening her cardigan. "Just like last time." "I know, dear," Robert patted her hand. "But we'll get there. We always do." As they waited, James noticed something troubling. The gate agents helped several other passengers with questions, but seemed to look right past the Thompsons. When an announcement came for priority boarding, the couple stood up again. "That's us, Martha," Robert said, gathering their carry-on bags. But as they approached the line, another gate agent redirected them. "General boarding hasn't started yet," the agent said without checking their tickets. "We have priority boarding, young man," Robert explained patiently, showing their passes again. The agent finally looked at their tickets, seeming surprised. "Oh, I apologize," he said quickly, but James could hear that the apology wasn't very sincere. James watched as the Thompsons finally boarded, noting how they held their heads high despite the treatment they'd received. He'd heard Martha telling Robert about their grandson as they walked past. "Michael will be so proud when we make it to his graduation," she said. "First in the family to get a master's degree." "He gets his brains from you, dear," Robert replied with clear pride in his voice. 40 years of teaching, and you always said education was the key." As they disappeared down the jetway, James felt a mix of emotions. He was angry at how his staff had treated these distinguished passengers, but he was also moved by their grace under pressure. When his boarding group was finally called, he made sure to choose a seat where he could observe more. Walking down the aisle of his own plane, James felt strange. This wasn't his private jet with its leather seats and personal service. This was the real Skyward Airlines experience, and so far, what he had seen troubled him deeply. As he stored his small bag in the overhead compartment, he wondered what else he would learn during this flight, especially about how the Thompsons and others like them were treated in the air. The large plane climbed steadily through the clouds, leaving New York behind. James sat in seat 23E, a middle seat that felt much tighter than he remembered from the design specifications he had approved years ago. You could see the Thompsons 3 rows ahead, sitting together by the window. The first hour of the flight passed quietly. James noticed how the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. He watched carefully as they reached the Thompsons' row. "Would you like something to drink?" the flight attendant asked, her voice noticeably cooler than it had been with other passengers. "Yes, please," Martha said warmly, trying to catch the attendant's eye. "Could we have 2 cups of hot tea with lemon?" The flight attendant nodded quickly and moved on. James noticed she hadn't written down their request, unlike she had done for other passengers. 10 minutes later, she returned with their drinks, without any lemon. "I'm sorry," Robert said politely, raising his hand to get her attention as she rushed past. "We had asked for lemon with our tea." "We're out of lemons," the attendant replied without stopping. James knew this wasn't true. He had seen her give lemon to another passenger just moments ago. Martha touched her husband's arm gently. "It's fine, Robert. Remember how different it was on our first flight together? Back in 1975? James found himself leaning slightly closer, curious about their conversation. "How could I forget?" Robert chuckled softly. "It was right after we got married. The flight attendants treated us like royalty then. It was a different airline, of course." "Pacific Airways," Martha nodded, stirring her tea. "They went out of business long ago, but I remember how kind everyone was. The pilot even came out to greet all the passengers." "Things have changed so much," Robert said quietly. "We've flown hundreds of times since then, taking trips to visit our students who moved away, going to education conferences. And now going to see our grandson graduate," Martha added proudly. "But I have to say, dear, This airline has been the most challenging to fly with. James felt his chest tighten as he listened. The Thompsons spoke softly, but their words carried clearly to where he sat. Remember last year? Martha continued. When we tried to use our premium points for an upgrade. The agent said the system was down, but then the couple behind us got their upgrade right away. I noticed that too, Robert sighed. I've been keeping track, you know. In the past 2 years, we've flown Skyward Airlines 12 times, and every single time, something similar happens. Martha adjusted her glasses and pulled out a small notebook from her purse. I've been writing it all down, actually. The delayed responses, the forgotten requests, the extra random security checks. I was thinking of writing a letter to the airline's management, but she shook her head. I doubt it would make any difference. James wanted to stand up right then and tell them who he was. He wanted to apologize for every bad experience they'd had, but he knew he needed to see more to understand the full extent of what was happening on his airline. You know what keeps me going, Martha, Robert said, taking his wife's hand. Remembering what we always taught our students, that change comes from persistence and dignity. We spent 40 years in the classroom teaching young minds to stand up for what's right. We can't give up now. Martha smiled at her husband, squeezing his hand. You're right, as always. And at least we're together. That's what matters most. As James watched this exchange, he felt a deep sense of shame. These were exactly the kind of passengers any airline should value: loyal, patient, understanding. Yet his company had repeatedly failed them. He took out his phone and started making notes, disguising them as casual texting. Every detail the Thompsons mentioned would need to be addressed. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, making the overhead bins rattle, but James barely noticed. His mind was already racing with ideas for changes that needed to be made. Big changes that would affect every level of his airline's operations. As the flight continued across the country, James kept watching everything happening around him. His middle seat, which had felt so uncomfortable at first, now gave him the perfect view of the entire cabin. The next few hours showed him patterns he never would have noticed from his office. The lunch service started about 3 hours into the flight. James watched as the flight attendants moved down the aisle with their cart. They smiled and chatted with some passengers, talking about meal choices and offering recommendations. But when they reached the Thompsons' row, something changed. Chicken or pasta? The flight attendant asked quickly, barely making eye contact. Could you tell us what comes with each meal? Martha asked politely. It's all listed in the menu in your seat pocket, the attendant replied, already turning toward the next row. James knew there were no menus in the seat pockets. The airline had stopped providing them 2 months ago to save money. Robert spoke up gently. I'm sorry, we don't have any menus. The flight attendant sighed loudly. Chicken has rice. Pasta has tomato sauce. Her tone made it clear she didn't want to explain more. We'll take the chicken, please, Martha said, still keeping her warm smile. The attendant practically dropped their trays on their tray tables and moved on. James pulled out his phone again, pretending to play a game while actually taking notes. He watched as the same flight attendant spent several minutes explaining every detail of both meals to a younger couple sitting nearby. The pattern continued throughout the meal service. When Martha asked for an extra napkin, her request was forgotten. When Robert's drink was served without ice, though he had asked for it, the attendant was already too far away to call back. Yet James noticed other passengers' similar requests were handled quickly and cheerfully. A young boy across the aisle dropped his fork, and within seconds, a flight attendant brought him a new one with a smile. 10 minutes later, when Robert accidentally knocked his fork off his tray, he had to wait almost half an hour for a replacement. James noticed something else too. The Thompsons weren't the only ones receiving this treatment. An elderly Asian couple a few rows ahead faced similar delays and dismissive responses. A woman wearing a hijab was repeatedly overlooked when she pressed her call button for assistance. He watched as Martha took out her small notebook again, quietly writing down the time and details of each incident. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, but her face remained composed. Robert noticed and covered her hand with his. Remember what Principal Davis used to say, he whispered to her. Document everything. That's how he helped change things at the school. Martha nodded, squeezing his hand. 40 years of teaching taught us that, didn't it? Sometimes change takes time and evidence. James felt a deep respect for their approach. They weren't causing a scene or demanding attention. Instead, they were quietly documenting everything, staying dignified despite the unfair treatment. As the flight progressed, James started noticing smaller things too. How the flight attendants would lean in close to chat with some passengers but keep physical distance from others. How some travelers' requests were met with warm smiles while others received only curt nods. How the simple act of asking for a blanket or headphones seemed to get very different responses depending on who was asking. He thought about the customer satisfaction reports on his desk back at headquarters. How many stories like the Thompsons were hidden in those numbers? How many passengers had given up on complaining and simply accepted this treatment as normal? Looking at his watch, James realized they still had 2 hours of flight time left. He decided to use this time to document every interaction he could see. Like Martha with her notebook, he would gather evidence. But unlike her, he knew his documentation would lead to immediate action once this flight landed. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, stronger this time. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on, and the aircraft shook enough to make several passengers gasp. James noticed Martha gripping her armrest tightly, while Robert patted her hand reassuringly. A sudden sharp drop made a few bags fall from the overhead compartments. As the plane steadied itself, James saw Martha's notebook slide from her lap and land near his feet. He picked it up and, despite his role as an undercover CEO, decided this was a good moment to finally talk with them. "Excuse me," he said, standing carefully during a smoother moment. "I believe this is yours." He made his way to their row, holding out the notebook. "Oh, thank you so much," Martha said warmly, taking the notebook. "Robert, isn't this gentleman kind? Would you like to sit with us for a moment? Until the turbulence passes." She gestured to the empty aisle seat next to Robert. James accepted the offer, partly because the shaking plane made standing difficult, and partly because he genuinely wanted to learn more about their experiences. "I'm James," he said simply, using his undercover name. "Martha Thompson," she smiled, "and this is my husband, Robert. We're on our way to our grandson's graduation." 45 years of marriage, Robert added proudly, "and we're still going on adventures together." The plane shook again, and Martha held her notebook tighter. "We were just talking about how air travel has changed over the years," she said. "Robert and I have seen quite a lot of changes since our first flight together in 1975. Would you tell me about it?" James asked, genuinely curious to hear their perspective. "Well," Robert began, his eyes lighting up with the memory. "Back then, flying was an event. People dressed up for it. The service was different too, more personal, you might say. Though some airlines were better than others for people like us," Martha added quietly. "Some wouldn't even sell us tickets in those early days." James listened intently as they shared stories from their decades of travel. They told him about their careers as educators. Martha teaching high school English and Robert as a middle school math teacher. They talked about flying to educational conferences, visiting former students who had moved across the country, and now traveling to see family. "Our grandson Michael," Martha said proudly, showing James a photo from her wallet, "is getting his master's degree in engineering. First in the family to go to graduate school. Both of you being teachers must have inspired him," James observed. "We hope so," Robert smiled. "We always taught our students that education opens doors. Though sometimes," he added with a gentle sigh, "those doors are harder to open for some people than others." The turbulence had calmed, but the conversation continued. James learned about their systematic approach to documenting their travel experiences, something they had learned from years of dealing with various challenges in the education system. "You see," Martha explained, showing him her notebook, "we keep track of everything. Times, dates, specific incidents. Not to cause trouble, but because change only happens when you can show patterns." "And have you seen any patterns?" James asked, although he already knew the answer. The Thompsons exchanged a knowing look. "On this airline particularly," Robert said carefully, "we've noticed that some passengers seem to receive different treatment than others. The staff are never openly rude, but it's in the small things," Martha finished. "The forgotten requests, the delayed responses, the assumption that we don't belong in priority boarding despite our status." James felt a deep sadness hearing their experiences laid out so clearly. Here was a distinguished couple who had spent their lives educating young people, who had done everything right. bought priority tickets, maintained airline status, stayed polite despite poor treatment. And yet they were still dealing with subtle but persistent discrimination. The morning after his flight, James arrived at his office earlier than usual. His casual clothes were gone, replaced by his usual suit, but the memories of yesterday's flight were still fresh in his mind. Sarah, his assistant, noticed something different about him as soon as he walked in. "How was your flight, sir?" she asked, following him into his office with her tablet ready. "Eye-opening," James replied, his voice serious. "I need you to help me with something important. Cancel all my meetings for the next 3 days. We have work to do." Sarah nodded, already tapping on her tablet. She had never seen her boss look so determined. "What do you need?" "First, I want every customer complaint we've received in the last 2 years. Everything. Emails, phone calls, social media posts, written letters. Also, get me the customer satisfaction surveys, but this time, I want them broken down by demographics." As Sarah left to gather the information, James pulled out the notes he had taken on his phone during the flight. He had written down every interaction he had observed, just like Martha Thompson with her notebook. Now it was time to see if these incidents were part of a larger pattern. By lunchtime, his large office looked completely different. The walls were covered with charts and printouts. Sarah had helped him create a timeline of complaints, using different colored sticky notes to mark patterns. The data told a troubling story. "Look at this," James said, pointing to one of the charts. "When we track customer satisfaction scores by demographic groups, there are clear differences. It's not just random bad experiences." Sarah stood next to him, frowning at the numbers. "And here," she added, pointing to another chart, "priority boarding complaints are 3 times higher from certain groups of passengers." James picked up another report. "I found 15 incidents exactly like what happened to the Thompsons, priority passengers being told to wait for general boarding. And those are just the ones who actually filed complaints." He walked to the window, looking out at the planes taking off and landing. His airline. His responsibility. "Get me the head of customer service, the head of training, and the head of operations," he told Sarah. "I want them here in an hour." When the 3 department heads arrived, they found their CEO surrounded by data and looking more serious than they had ever seen him. James didn't waste any time. "Yesterday, I flew on one of our regular flights," he began. "What I saw was unacceptable." He described everything he had witnessed, from the gate agent's behavior to the flight attendant's discriminatory treatment. The department heads shifted uncomfortably in their seats as James showed them the data he had gathered. None of them could deny the patterns in front of them. "But our customer satisfaction scores are generally good," the head of customer service tried to argue. "Because we're not looking at the right numbers," James countered. "We've been averaging everything together, hiding the real problems. When we break down the data, the truth is clear." He showed them more charts. Waiting times at check-in counters, response times to passenger requests, upgrade approval rates. Every piece of data told the same story. "This isn't about a few bad employees," James said firmly. "This is about systemic problems in how we operate. And it stops now." He pulled out a final document, the notes he had made during his sleepless night after the flight. It was a detailed plan for completely overhauling their training and service protocols. "Starting today, we're going to look at everything differently," he announced. "Every policy, every procedure, every training program. We're going to fix this from the ground up." The department heads looked at each other nervously. They knew that big changes were coming to Skyward Airlines, whether they were ready or not. As the meeting ended, James looked once more at the photo he had taken of Martha Thompson's notebook. A careful documentation of their experiences had helped him see what he should have noticed years ago. Now it was time to make things right. Over the next few weeks, Skyward Airlines went through the biggest changes in its history. James moved his office from the 32nd floor down to the 3rd floor, right next to the Employee Training Center. He wanted to be close to where the real work of transformation would happen. The first change came in the form of a new training program. James hired Dr. Angela Chen, an expert in workplace diversity and customer service, to completely rebuild how they trained their staff. But he didn't just leave it to the experts. He made sure that Thompson's story was at the heart of everything. "Every employee needs to understand why we're doing this," James told Dr. Chen as they planned the training. "This isn't just about rules and procedures. It's about real people and their experiences. The training center buzzed with activity as groups of employees came through. Gate agents, flight attendants, baggage handlers, and even office staff. Everyone had to participate. They watched videos about unconscious bias, practiced handling different situations, and learned how small actions could have big impacts on passengers. Sarah, James' assistant, helped create a new system for tracking customer experiences. Every complaint, every compliment, every survey response was now categorized carefully. They could spot patterns quickly and address problems before they became habits. "Look at this," Sarah showed James one morning, pointing to her tablet. "We've created an app for our staff that gives them real-time feedback on their interactions. If they're spending less time with certain passengers or responding differently to similar requests, the system notifies them." James nodded approvingly. "But remember, it's not about punishing people. It's about helping them do better." The changes weren't always easy. Some employees resisted at first, saying they had always done things a certain way. Others worried about being watched too closely. But James made sure everyone understood why these changes mattered. He started joining random flights again, this time not in disguise, but as himself. He would talk to the crew before each flight, reminding them of the airline's new mission. "Every passenger deserves our best," became his regular message. Every single one. The physical spaces of the airline changed too. Priority boarding areas were redesigned to be clearer and more welcoming. Signs were updated to be easier to read and understand in multiple languages. Even the uniforms were changed to include name tags in different languages. One of the biggest changes was the new customer feedback system. James remembered how Martha Thompson had carefully written down her experiences in her notebook. Now, every passenger could easily share their experiences through a simple app or phone call. More importantly, they could see how the airline responded to their feedback. "We're not just collecting complaints," James explained to his board of directors. "We're showing people that their voices matter, that we're listening and making real changes." The costs of all these changes were significant. Some board members worried about the expense, but James stood firm. "This isn't just about doing the right thing," he told them. "It's about building a better airline. Happy passengers become loyal customers." 3 months into the changes, the numbers started proving him right. Customer satisfaction scores were rising across all groups. Complaints were down, and more importantly, the gaps in service quality between different passenger groups were starting to close. But James knew numbers weren't everything. He started a new tradition of reading customer feedback letters at every staff meeting. Sometimes they were complaints that needed to be addressed. But more and more often, they were letters of thanks, noting the positive changes people were seeing. "Yesterday, a gate agent spent extra time helping my elderly mother understand her connection," one letter read. "She said it was the first time in years she didn't feel rushed or ignored at an airport." Each positive letter was shared with the whole company, reminding everyone why the changes mattered. The transformation wasn't just about new rules or systems. It was about changing how people felt when they flew with Skyward Airlines. 6 months after his undercover flight, James sat in his office reading an email that made him smile. It was from Martha Thompson, and the subject line read, "A wonderful change at Skyward Airlines." "Dear customer service team," the email began. "My husband Robert and I recently flew with Skyward Airlines again, this time to visit our daughter in Chicago. We wanted to tell you about our experience because something has changed, and it's important to recognize improvement when we see it." James leaned forward in his chair, reading every word carefully. Martha described how different everything felt from the moment they reached the airport. The gate agent had welcomed them warmly, carefully checking their priority boarding status. The flight attendants had been attentive and friendly, treating every passenger with equal respect. "It wasn't just us," Martha wrote. "We watched how the staff treated everyone, and there was a noticeable difference. Whatever changes you've made, they're working. For the first time in years, we felt truly valued as passengers." James looked at the clock. The Thompsons' next flight was scheduled for the following week. He had checked their booking history. After a moment of thought, he began typing a reply. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, my name is James Mitchell, and I'm the CEO of Skyward Airlines. We've actually met before, though you knew me only as James, a fellow passenger on your flight to Los Angeles 6 months ago when your grandson Michael graduated. I was on that flight undercover, trying to understand our passengers' experiences firsthand. What I witnessed, especially in how you were treated, opened my eyes and changed our airline forever. Your careful documentation in that small notebook, Mrs. Thompson, and your dignified response to poor treatment helped me see what needed to change. Would you and Mr. Thompson be willing to meet with me when you're next at the airport? I'd like to thank you personally for helping make our airline better. The following week, James waited in the airline's newly renovated premium lounge. When the Thompsons arrived, Martha immediately recognized him, despite his business suit replacing the casual clothes he'd worn on the flight. "It was you?" she said softly, a smile spreading across her face. "Robert, look, it's James from that flight." James stood up to greet them, shaking their hands warmly. "Please sit down. I have so much to thank you for." Over the next hour, James showed them how their experience had transformed the airline. He shared the training videos that now featured their story, with names changed for privacy, the new customer service guidelines, and the dramatically improved satisfaction scores. "Your notebook, Mrs. Thompson," James said, "taught us the importance of paying attention to details. Now we have a whole system inspired by your careful documentation." Martha wiped away a tear as Robert squeezed her hand. "We never expected this," she said. "We just wanted to be treated fairly." "And that's exactly what every passenger deserves," James replied. "But I have one more thing to ask you both. Would you consider joining our customer advisory board? We need voices like yours to help us keep improving." The Thompsons looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that only couples married for decades can have. Then Robert smiled. "We spent our lives teaching young people to make a difference," he said. "It would be an honor to continue that work here." As they talked about the future, James noticed other passengers in the lounge being treated with the same care and respect that the Thompsons were now receiving. No more overlooked requests, no more dismissive responses. The change was real and lasting. Before the Thompsons left for their flight, Martha took out her notebook, the same one she'd had on that first flight with James. "I'm still keeping notes," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "But these days, I'm writing down very different things." James watched as they boarded their flight, treated with the dignity they had always deserved. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest things, like a passenger's notebook and a CEO's decision to listen and learn.